Yeah, so you know, really interested in hearing artists talk about their work. It's something I kind of really enjoyed, always enjoyed to this day. And then a little bit later on, I went on to study philosophy and developed an interest in philosophy of art. And I was really arrested by the kind of level of precision and the kind of power that these concepts and these tools of argument could give you. So I went to a conference back in January, and I met Michael and Aline, who are here from University of Kent, and joined a panel discussion with them discussing philosophy of art, whilst I was working here at Town, where I was kind of coming as a representative of the gallery. And had a really, really exciting discussion, and I just thought it would be a great opportunity to bring them, as well as Mark, who has exhibited here and also spoken here on a couple of occasions on a variety of topics, to the gallery to meet Blue Monkey Network, to talk to artists who are working, who themselves talk about their work, and just really have the opportunity to mix and hopefully some interesting things to emerge. So if we could have a round of applause for my panel of and Aline Duprez as well. So yeah, I guess I'll get kicked off. I would like to say as well, please chip in anything. That's nonsense. That's brilliant. Everything's up for grabs. So yeah, I wanted to really start off kind of with an introductory question about the philosophy of art, and really kind of for the uninitiated, situating it kind of, I suppose, within a kind of common experience. So I might start with you, Michael. Could I ask, what kind of broadly, it's a difficult question, kind of what the philosophy of art is, what kind of concerns you have as a philosopher of art, and maybe how that differs from other types of things, maybe like being an art critic or something like that?
Well, that's quite a few questions there. So I'm trying to sort of, one thing that I'm often get asked about how philosophy of art differs from various things, art history and art criticism. I mean, a distinction between art history and philosophy of art is that I should say I'm currently head of the History of Art department at the University of Kent, and so I'm just explaining why I do something slightly different from many of my colleagues. And this is what I tell them, that where art history looks at particular movements, particular artists, and perhaps at a broad level, particular periods of art, particular visual cultures, history of art tends to look at more general overarching issues. It might look at, in the past, it's looked at questions about beauty, for instance. Contemporary philosophy of art has largely put that aside and looks at other things. It may ask what's the importance of morals or ethics in art, for instance, or it might ask how pictures work, or it might ask whether pornography can be art. And all those questions, as I say, they're sort of overarching questions which apply, across cultures, which is also something, that has to be done very carefully and justified. So you mentioned art criticism. I know, Elaine, you have a good line on this.
Sure, yeah. So first of all, I can't but agree with what you said earlier on the difference between art history and philosophy of art, but I just want to add a little bit to that. So for me, the art historian, as you say, is more thinking about specific styles or genre of art, so they're looking at works of art and trying to determine how or why does this specific work of art came to be in the way that it is. Why is it that this artist chose to create this work of art? Whereas I think for me, what philosophers of art try to do is looking at the kind of words that art historians use, the words that artists use in describing their practice, and trying to determine what some of those concepts mean. So for example, when an art historian is talking about a relationship of influence between two artists, so when they say that a certain artist has influence on other artists, the philosopher, or at least that's where I see myself as a philosopher come into play, is to really try to determine what that relationship of influence really means, whether or not it already carries a kind of normative baggage. For instance, if influence is, for example, always a kind of positive, imitative relationship, or if it can mean other things. So the art historian, for me, is looking at specific works of art, whereas the philosopher, or at least the analytical philosopher of art, is looking what those concepts mean that are in play when we're talking about art. And then to bring in the art critic, and this third person that is interested in art. Noel Cowell wrote a small book on art criticism, and so for him, the art critic is involved in evaluating works of art, which is something that I think the art historian is not necessarily doing. They're describing works of art, they're describing art practice, they're talking about contextual features in which works of art arose, whereas the art critic is really bringing that narrative of the art historian into an evaluation of the work of art.
Okay.
Whereas the art philosopher doesn't do that either.
Excellent. And Mark, you teach on a practical course, you teach...
Practice-based.
Yeah.
Thanks for putting me between two philosophers.
Oh, well, yeah.
What a good move.
No, it was last night.
I agree with everything they said. If I could just say that I studied painting at St. St. Martin's in the Royal College. But given my age, when I first studied St. St. Martin's, I studied art history. And then by the time I got to the Royal College 3 years later, I did critical historical studies with visual studies, etc. So it kind of reflects the evolution of thinking in certain areas. French theory became very popular, say, around 1990, obviously beforehand. But at that point, I was moving away from reading the likes of Gombrich, Herbert Reed, etc., John Golding, and then looking more towards, obviously, French theory, etc., continental philosophy. For me, the relationship between art history, philosophy, I've almost sort of tried not to see them too separate.
Right.
So I've kind of jumped around like a magpie, taking little bits from here, little bits from there. So I'm quite excited.
And what, to use them for what? How, like?
Well, to use them predominantly because of teaching quite a bit. As I mentioned to someone earlier, I've worked at 17, 18 universities. And one of the challenges I've had, there's 89 students behind from Brighton who I've been working with today, is to find vocabulary so that when I talk about their work, I reference, I like to discuss their work analytically to try to find words that can unpack image or pictures or depictions, etc., etc. And I'm far from accomplished at it, but it's just a way of trying to negotiate that discourse. And so I was looking for the shortest description of philosophy I could come across.
Right.
And the shortest one I came across was Nigel Warburton. And he said philosophy is a critical engagement with ideas and words.
Okay.
Which I thought was quite nice to say. But the challenge is to, for me, when I'm in the studio environments in Glasgow or Brighton or wherever, is to try to articulate that, to negotiate that with students so that they can get greater understanding of their practice.
Okay, so that's kind of where you think the value comes.
For me, yes.
Yeah.
And a particular passion as a painter, and this is probably aligns me with phenomenology to a large extent,
Right.
analytic and cognitive.
Which just to...
Well, the engagement with phenomena.
Okay.
I mean, Michael could go into great depth, I'm sure, but essentially material, matter, etc., etc. And obviously painting, for me, is about touch, stuff, gesture, etc. And there's a lot of baggage with it historically, obviously, like the word beauty, a lot of baggage. But it's still worthy of discourse and trying to articulate and talk about it.
Yeah.
So that's, I've been talking about these kind of things with some of the guys earlier today.
Okay.
And obviously doing it, yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's where I come from, because I'm a studio-based painter that does a bit of teaching.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. So I thought kind of a nice point of departure for today might be talking a little bit about Green Pleasant Land, which I think was open a little bit earlier, and hopefully beforehand a few people had the opportunity walk around and have a look at. I suppose I'm interested in how you, as philosophers, you know, and having philosophical concerns, you respond to different media, and you know, whether you treat them all the same, whether you treat them differently, and how you negotiate those differences. Is there a specific aesthetics of photography, and why?
Okay.
Well, I was like already preparing an answer to the first part of your introduction, what you were saying there, namely what happens when a philosopher of art enters an exhibition and what is their engagement with the exhibition. And so I mean, for myself, in the research that I'm doing right now is about curating. It's what happens in curated exhibitions. So for me, so it's not necessarily the case that philosophers of art are just interested in very narrow, in a very narrow understanding of a specific art form or a specific art of a specific art kind. So for me, as a philosopher, when I enter this exhibition, I'm interested in seeing what happens when a certain concept or a certain theme is expressed or discussed through an arrangement of works of art, namely what arises from juxtaposing several works of art that haven't been put together in one room up until the point that they were in this exhibition, and up until the point that they had this like overarching narrative applied to them. But yeah, about the aesthetics of photography, there's it's like aesthetic.
I think a lot of there is certainly there's in philosophy of art there's a kind of a little cottage industry, including very significant figures in the UK who are
I'm sorry to interrupt. You don't have a microphone, do you, by any chance?
I could.
It's a bit hard to hear in the back, unless you're speaking at the volume that I'm speaking.
Sure. Shall I just try speaking louder? And
That would
you
be
should
brilliant.
just throw something.
Thank you so much.
That's
Especially as it's a somewhat, intense.
Sure.
The acoustics are
The
difficult.
nature of what you're talking about is
Would it
quite
be better if we
intense.
closed the door, maybe?
I don't know, it's been very,
Or
very
maybe
hot.
switch the chair or something. Yeah, if you want to come a bit closer.
No, is it too
I was going to walk around, I'm going to do the same so you can get the voice.
That can be fabulous.
I'll
You
do
can
that.
cut this bit and use it as
Walk and talk.
Yeah.
So here's something about the what philosophers work on when they talk about when they work on philosophy, when they work on photography. Predominantly, currently, there's a big focus on the epistemological status of photography. That means how it is connected to the real world and how it provides knowledge of the real world when it does so. And I won't go into the kinds of ins and outs of this, but I think some of you, you'll know already that there are theories, say by the American philosopher C.S. Peirce around indexical representations. It's really a kind of updated debate around that. There's clearly, someone creates a painting and there's a link between what they paint, if it's a representational painting, and the painting. And there's a kind of causal link because, the artist, there's light travels to the other side, stuff happens in the brain, and it comes out in a certain way on the canvas, and you get a Constable or a Turner or whatever. It's much more direct, that causal link, in the case of photography. But that creates some challenges, if it's much more direct, if it's just determined by, photographs determined by what is, what's in there in front of the camera. Then what is the role of the artist? You have to give an account of photography which allows some kind of agency for the photographer, and yet acknowledges this unique kind of causal connection photographs have with their subject matter. So that's one kind of challenge philosophers look at. But I have to say, you know, such a philosopher walks into an exhibition like that, like this, and they may not immediately be able to say anything that's going to illuminate individual artworks. You know, their insights may not work like that. But some do. There's one who's working a lot on photography at the moment at Warwick, Dermot Costello, who's doing a lot of work on this. Someone else at Hull, Dawn Wilson. And I know they're very, very interested in individual photographs as well. And they're jointly signing up to, I won't go into the details, it's just a great sort of sexy name for their photography, their accounts of photography that they and some others are developing. They call it the new theory. I won't say anything more about it than that, but it does suggest that it's actually quite a vibrant field, which, you know, which it is at the moment.
Great. There are many photographers here. Yeah. So I'm not going to put any. Interesting. Did you enjoy the show? You enjoyed the show?
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, by all means.
What you said seems to be a very historical view of photography, because it seems to me currently the interaction between what you described as the painter is very much what happens now with the photographer. Unless you're sticking with the old school chemical darkroom approach, but even there was still a large degree of creativity involved in between the process of taking the photograph and producing the print. But now, where that would have been maybe 60-40 in favour of the photograph, now it seems to be 10-90 in favour of actually the process that happens after the image begins.
Yeah. I mean, the new theory is very much about putting more weight on what happens outside of lights going into the camera and being, you know, recorded. A photographic event, these theorists call it. You know, then something else happens. There's maybe today a digital encoding. Certain other things happen. The information is either preserved or it's lost. And in any case, it's you know, manifests in a whole range of ways through a range of processes. And put that way, analog photography, you know, speaking in such generic terms, the same applies. You know, as you've suggested, there are all kinds of things. You know, as a view of photographers, there are all kinds of things that happen in the darkroom. Photographers have all kinds of agency there, and that's something which these accounts are trying to acknowledge as well, which is something that photographic theory and philosophy hasn't acknowledged so much in the past.
I was just touching again on, would it be easier if I stood?
Yes.
Okay. So just touching on that notion of indexicality again. So that was interesting. That's a word that I've heard used in the literature. Could you kind of just expand on that a little bit more?
Sure. So it comes from this 19th century, early 20th century American philosopher C.S. Peirce. The name kind of looks like Pierce, but it's pronounced Perth, i.e. the other way around. He is the approach to understanding representation that he developed. It's a very general approach. He called it semiotics. It's a bit different from what we now, or since the 1980s, came to discuss as semiotics often. And he divided representation into three general kinds. And one of those kinds is the index. And the index works, it's different from other kinds in that it involves a direct physical link of some kind. It gets its content from a direct physical link. And this is one index. I can indicate something by pointing to it. There's a physical link between my finger, and you understand that what is indicated, pointed at, is represented. It's one version. Others, better known are things like these are natural science fossils, so footprints. So they are, if you like, impressions of certain things, objects, physical things that are preserved. And there's a causal link there. If the thing, you know, the dinosaur, whatever, the foot didn't exist, that mark would not be there. And so it's that causal link which carries the content so far as, you know, that fossil, that footprint has content for us. And photographs are like this too. This is the idea that they too are a kind of impression, and their existence is dependent on this causal link, which is also to say on the existence of the object which they are photographing. You can't, on this account, you can't photograph something which doesn't exist.
I think, Mark, you had a question to that.
just look like, would there be where would the equivalence occur in painting?
I have a similar question.
Because you wrote a very good paper, Philosophy in Painting, which was the graduate student stuff we've been reading. Did you mention Johns in that? Or not? I mean, that's in the paper I've
I'm
read.
not sure. I might have.
But how would you describe the equivalence, if it occurs?
I mean, so Peirce has another account for paintings, for ordinary paintings, drawings, for diagrams. He calls them iconic representations, and the idea is that their content, their representational value, depends on a resemblance that holds between the thing they represent and the representation. So if you have a little diagram of, I don't know, H2O, say, that structure of the, you know, the little rods and little bubbles, that would crudely correspond to what is out there in reality. That is, say, the molecule H2O is, you know, is two oxygen atoms bound to hydrogen, a single hydrogen, vice versa, in a particular way, not a chemist. And for him, more complex things like pictures, a painted picture, is going to be, roughly speaking, the same. So pictures really do share certain kinds of shapes, maybe something like an outline or a silhouette, wasn't very clear on it, with the things that they represent. And they'll share certain colours. You know, a red apple, picture of a red apple can only be made on this account with red paint. Otherwise, if you use blue paint, it'll depict a blue apple, or, you know, or a lemon if you use yellow, or so on. So in that case, that account frees the representation, the painting from that dependence on an actual object. So I could paint a picture of, you know, a bowl of fruits, and no such fruit bowl has to have existed. But for photography, you can't make a photograph of a fruit bowl unless that actual fruit bowl exists.
You can with digital photography.
Yeah,
you
can.
The thing breaks down, because you can also claim
Yeah.
that paintings are indexable at a different level of representation, i.e. level of projection. Think of Jackson Pollock.
Yes.
About to use that example.
Yeah.
So these distinctions, they're useful and they apply to sort of the majority of cases, but they also...
I think that's absolutely right. So people have done a lot of work into either trying to adapt or reject this general account of the person. And in the case of digital representation, digital photography, I think that's one case where, in fact, you can really defend Peirce, because if you start putting, I don't know, the Incredible Hulk into your film or whatever, there is no such Incredible Hulk in life. It's just invented. But you end up with caused you physical pain, didn't it? But the thing is, essentially, you know, what the filmmaker has done is create something that looks like a photograph, but it's no longer a photograph. That part of the film which represents the Incredible Hulk is now no longer it's now no longer photographic. It just looks like a photograph.
I just want to follow up on that. So the same is true with Photoshop. As soon as you start manipulating digital images to put in fruit in your fruit bowl that wasn't actually there, a lot of theorists would argue that at that point you're no longer using the medium of photography to manipulate your image. You're using another kind of medium, a digital medium. Because at that point the photograph as it was has already been made. You might either, 30 years back when Photoshop, maybe 40 years back, how was Photoshop? Before Photoshop existed, you could have maybe hand-painted something on the negative before you developed, or you could have obscured certain things in the dark room. But at that point, theorists would say the photograph has already been made. You're manipulating the printing of the photograph by either painting something on it, and you're using at that point the medium of painting. And so that's a way in which you could define it.
Which in a way asks the question, which is a philosophical question, is where does truth, where can it exist within the artifact, if it can exist at all? And in fact, I think it was published about 1999, so 18 years ago, the reconfigured eye visual truth in the post-photographic era, W.J.T. Mitchell. So quite a long time ago, it was all that, because of digital coming around and being academically analysed, it was obviously that scepticism and challenge of what it was doing to visual understanding became very, very prevalent, and obviously still is very prevalent. But going back to my response to that show was the thing that I thought when I went in there, and it's probably because I was taught by two photographers in there, which is strange for me to see the works. One was at A-level, John McKippen, his work was called Northumberland Park. The Aeroplane, which was in third part.
That's it. It's got the caption hidden under it.
Hidden, that's right, yes. And then Stezuker, John Stezuker at St. Martin's, so quite a gap between the two. So for me, on a personal level, it was quite romantic seeing those works, brought all memories back. And yet I found the show very dystopian as an exhibition, quite dark, on how the digital has impacted on painting, and predominantly to do with how it compresses historical notions of history, atemporal through to linear concepts of time, is how the photographs embody time. So I was thinking, how do they represent the time? Because I was probably around when some of the shots were done. You see what I mean? So that threw me a little bit. And then the other thing I think about with photographers, and I tend to have little discussions with them from time to time, I like to say to them things like, where is the gesture in the photograph? And then you always have a good little debate about it.
What do you mean by that? What are you asking?
Well, that's what I'm asking them.
Right.
I'm just curious to know, because obviously, you know,
Is that a similar gesture to the kind of physicality that Mike was talking about with the index?
well, it could be. So in a sense, probably answered partly, but it's just one of those areas about where to do with authorship, and gesture. And so when I'm looking at that work there, for me, I'm reflecting it in relation to my painting practice, because I'm always using a brush or whatever. Do you know what I mean? And I just find it sets off discourse, you know, which is good in a way. I'm not a photographer and painter, but it just allows me to think about painting through a photographic lens, etc. So that's
if you want your example on what is truth, if you want to see that, just watch the BBC weather photos every morning, because nobody seems to be able to resist taking a photograph of the weather without using one of the filters on their phone or tweaking it in Photoshop. And the BBC, in its turn, has no kind of visual editorial judgments on those. It puts them up.
But by
and Reuters went to the extent of actually saying it would not take photographs from press reporters unless they were in the original format, because it was so afraid of being faked.
But if someone was being terribly pedantic, the fact it's being viewed through a screen, which will possibly adjust
it's another level of reality.
I mean, my thing is truth doesn't exist. You know, I'm going almost that extreme. You know, so almost what the reading I'm doing about the digital is to do with the sense of artifice. And even though I think painting is very authentic, it is authentic, it's also dealing with artifice, the interface between reality and non-reality. So that's why I think painting has a very strong philosophical premise built into it, because it's relationship to history.
And that's what's missing with photography, isn't it?
No, there can still be artifice in photography.
One thing I would say, I take issue with when you say you're sceptical about truth, that there is any truth. I think that's a statement that can mean a range of things. But, I guess the point I would want to make here is that we shouldn't let go of the conviction that there is a real world out there, number one, and that there are matters of fact, that people will be not just about the physical state of things, but that if somebody is in pain, they genuinely are in pain. That's not a fact that is relative. If they're happy, then they probably are genuinely happy. That's not something that's you can change by just changing your perspective. And once you get to that point, I think it's very close to being roughly speaking, objective about moral facts.
But what do you think?
I took your comment, I might be wrong, to mean that you were talking about truth in representation rather than truth in the physical world, which is what Mike's talking about.
Yeah, probably representation of what it can actually be an equivalence to. So for example, I'm fascinated by the word resemblance when you're looking at paintings. That something resembles something. It's very complex and problematic. So we look at late Cézanne, where he leaves a lot of bits missing, and you can configure it in your head. It's always written about, like Cézanne's Doubt, Merleau-Ponty. It's written about with great intensity and eloquence, but the viewer has to construct it. It's not, there's slippage in many different ways. And I think the things I've been reading about the digital have really flagged up how that exists in current, through contemporary media platforms, etc., etc. And I'm very conscious of how, when I work with students, how they're accessing information, try to interpret information, work with information, work with experience, etc. To me, this is where the link is with philosophy, because it means you're perpetually having debates around things like representation, depiction, what a picture is, what an image is, etc. While engaging with the materiality, the base material of paint, which I think is very authentic. Thinking of Elkin's idea of the alchemical connection and where its origins. So for me, there's a tension in these different areas, but I hope they're exciting tensions.
What's the difference between resemblance and reference?
Resemblance and...
Something resembling something else or something referencing?
Well, it was resemblance and representation was my distinction. To represent something is a very particular quality. I think to resemble something is looking for more of an equivalence of how something appears. To try to make something, and obviously resemblance has, Michael knows better than me, but I associate more, for example, with figurative work, historically, whereas representation can go, for me, into other terrain. So I can see representation, let's say, an obvious example is a Rothko, but resemblance you would probably equate more, say, with looking at painters, say like Da Vinci or maybe Renaissance painters, etc. So and obviously there's been interpretations historically with the terminologies, and they do, I think they're not always fixed, but I still think they're valid within studio environments.
But then is that the kind of terminological, is that the way that terminology tends to be deployed in your work or in work that you're used to reading?
Sure. When we're thinking about the epistemological baggage that representation can carry, there's various questions that we can ask. And I think some of them will be about representation. Is that loud enough?
Yeah.
Okay. Projecting. So some of those questions will be about representation or what it means for something to represent something else. But I think it then takes us to another question, namely, okay, granted that certain representations have a connection to something that is out there. And the next question that we then can ask, okay, but what do we do with the knowledge or with the propositional content of that representation? And I think that brings us then to further epistemological questions of the value of photography or the value of painting. And I think the debate tends to be divided in the term that when it comes to the epistemological content that photography can carry, it seems to be that there is more of a reliable truth there, if you consider to the fact.
And that's part of the difference in how you might enjoy or experience.
Yeah, so I
show
mean,
like
if you
next door.
just consider that photography is used in court as evidence,
Mm.
there is a photograph of something. I mean, it has this very direct relationship, not only to what has happened in the outside world, but it has a direct relation to truth in itself, which doesn't seem to be isn't the case for painting or for other representational arts. And so I think when you take those considerations into an exhibition like this, you just encounter some kind of boundary or a kind of threshold that you need to surpass, namely considering, well, okay, photography can do more than merely show, first of all, what is out there and make truth statements about the world. There's just a question there.
Are you saying that philosophy, when it has to do with painting, has more of a scientific consideration of painting than photography? Because it just sounds like the connection between epistemology and what's real is all to do with the physical world. And say when someone's pointing the camera, there's not almost like there's not a subjective nature to that person pointing the camera. Or maybe, what about photography and painting as art and philosophy rather than philosophy and painting? So, what kind of does a metaphysical kind of consideration come in then? And how does that bear on this kind of epistemology, or the psychic directness of painting, say?
Yeah, so I think realizing the fact that photography as a mode of representation can be subjective is an important starting point to ask the epistemological questions that we want to ask about photography. Because merely seeing it as an objective way of capturing what is out there already inhibits the kind of epistemological questions that we could ask about it. Because if we presume, well, photography is just an agent using an apparatus to record something, the agency of that person is merely pushing the button. Whereas if you realize that photography is more than just pushing a button, it is about taking your camera to somewhere, deciding to photograph something, framing it, determining well, a whole range of notions of how you're going to light the image, or on how you're going to develop and how you're going to print it. I mean, and all these kind of expanded ideas on the mere technical aspects of photography and the mere framing aspect of photography imbues a sense of subjectivity, which then feeds into how we might want to approach the.
I mean, there are some interesting convergences in there. I mean, looking at Suzanne Dirge's work and the way that sort of she would take the light box and sort of put it in the river, and this idea of sort of recording time passing, and something about that physical process actually kind of. That the process itself having a kind of subjective resonance for her.
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at a painting or when we look at a drawing, I think we've already moved well beyond the point that we're just taking like a formalist point of view of just looking what the painting or the picture itself depicts. I mean, when we go into an exhibition that shows painting, we're interested in what the artist did to come to that point, which is what brings me back to what I talked about, what the art historian is. Art historians would namely like trying to detect what the kind of path of the artist was to create that image. So I think part of what the interesting point of the debates around photography in philosophy is bringing to attention that kind of aesthetic attitude towards photography is warranted. Because as you say, some artists decided to take their camera into a river, so we shouldn't just look at her work as a picture of a river. It's more than that, there's more going on.
I don't think I was just trying to get at the kind of realities and truth that you're saying, that photography through a direct indexicality gets at truth, but it seems to be more of a scientific truth, an evidential kind of truth. And I'm not saying that painting, photography doesn't have its own kind of agency. I'm just trying to get at, there's a different kind of directness in painting. And I'm interested in what kind of philosophy has to say about that, maybe.
Yes.
Or is it down to the kind of psychic and psychological dimensions there.
Did you have a...
Well, I just wanted to pick up on that really, because it seems to me that some of these terms are seemingly simple but actually philosophically quite complex. And I suppose I was thinking, truth. I mean, you're coming at it, it seems to me, through a particular tradition, but a Platonist would say, yes, in something like postula's prima vera, there is a truth. It's not the truth of indexicality. It is probably a Platonic truth. So to come back to your point, it seems to me that we sort of need to lay out what we mean by truth. And if you go down sort of pragmatist tradition route, that's a different notion of truth again. So that notion of an empirical, sort of out there positivistic truth is only one way of thinking about how art might treat it such.
Can I just add, scientists don't talk about truth, they talk about fact. Truth's a philosophical thing, it's not a scientific thing.
Yeah, I don't think scientists see it that way. I think they certainly feel they get truth much more often than philosophers do. I can tell you that for a fact. And I think it's pretty clear that they do on the whole for what their truths are. So I should try and answer this question about... So if, perhaps I'd put it the following way. A lot of what we've said about, if you like, the truth in photography, as you say, it's not, it's just the truth of, if you like, the snapshot as much as it is the truth of the art photograph. It's what can be said about not just photography in general, but photography as an art. I think that's actually a challenge, which certainly, judging by what philosophers have written on it, it remains to be really well treated by philosophers. That's my, I think most philosophers working in the area would own up to that. But I think they also aspire to try and say something about just what value it can have as an art. It's really clear that the value as an art, of it as an art, it has to emerge. It has to emerge from something beyond, what art photography shares with snapshot photography. It has to come from a different kind of source, and yet it clearly builds on what it is that makes photography, what art photography does share with the snapshot photo. But that's really just to say, I think there's a lot of work to be done. It's important work. It's interesting work.
Martin, did you have a follow-up? Sorry on that.
I was just going to, in relation to, because we were discussing the photographic and I was thinking the painting's relationship, from when I started the Royal College in 88, 89, so it was the YBA period and all that was happening. There was a Richter retrospective at the Tate in 90, which had a profound effect on certainly my generation of painters. So that we all stood around talking about how important photography was to painting. I think people like Peter Doig, Dexter Dogwood, and even Chapman's and people like that. And so there's always been an interface between the two, symbiotic. And to the point where you look at some of the German photographers like Thomas de Man, Thomas Struve, Gursky, who almost look like they're using an aesthetic drawn from the language of painting. And clearly you've got painters who've been fixated, hundreds with photography, thousands.
Yeah.
And of course you can go back to 1839, Paul de la Roche painting is dead, etc. And then you can go back to how painters engage with technology. If you talk about Vermeer, Camera Obscura, etc., etc. So the relationship between technological and the bridge between the elements has always been key to discourse.
And I suppose
They
that's
defined it in a way.
I suppose it's interesting in an exhibition as well that is about landscape as well, which is a tradition that kind of initially associated with
well, the hinterland's in vogue with painting, and that's why I thought the hinterland in there. So when you put that show together recently, and it was the Doig painting, you have the car with the police lights scenario. I mean, it's got the same feel of some of that work there. So I've seen out True Detectives or Mindhunters or something, that kind of thing. It was something creepy and eerie.
It's right up my street. Thank you very much. I was going to ask a little bit about kind of bringing artists in, you know, obviously comprising the audience. For Michael or Elaine or Mark, to talk a little bit about artistic intention and how that's figured in philosophical debate, you know, in more recent times, but also, you know, kind of throughout. How has that been? How has that been treated by philosophers?
Yeah, so I think in a way, a strategy to diffuse the debate that we just had now about truth, which is this very laden concept, is to actually just take its more friendly cousin, namely meaning. Talk about meaning in a way, image to make do without the concept of truth, which is to still talk meaningful about what happens in art. And so the concept of intention then becomes very interesting. So there's various philosophical views that have been taken in the past on what the role of intention is. So thinking about intention as a testimony that artists have given. So, for example, in these interviews, artists talk about what it is that they're doing, or what it is that they wanted to do, or what it is that they will do. So what is the role or the value or the weight that we should put on those expressions of intent as feeding into how we ought to appreciate their work, or how we ought to evaluate the success of their work, or the failure of their work. And so the philosophical field is somewhat divided into different camps. So there's philosophers thinking that we ought to not rely on intentions of artists, that we just ought to pay attention to the work in itself. Whereas then on the other hand, there's philosophers who believe that intention is relevant and important for appreciation in art, and then there's more like smaller positions in between that camp. Maybe there's the position of hypothetical intentionalists. Those are philosophers who believe that yes, okay, we have these testimonies of artists telling us what it is that they wanted to do in this work of art, but that doesn't necessarily fix the meaning of the work in itself. It is just one part of the data, one part of the information that we as the audience ought to take into account when we're constructing what could be the actual realized meaning of the work.
Because when I listened to Donovan Wiley in the clip, and the way that he sort of, it's almost like he's kind of circulating round this idea, and the creation of the work is almost like part of establishing the idea itself. You know, it's almost like something is attracted into making this work, and making the artwork is part of establishing what it's about. It seems almost kind of like a kind of evolving process, and it doesn't feel like intention can kind of straightforwardly, I don't know. It feels like that's quite a grey area when it comes to intention. I mean, could that be integrated into the traditions that you're describing?
I mean, one thing about intention is that intention is something that can happen. It can be a process, you know, developing intention. Artists can resolve an intention after, you know, the physical object, the artwork has been made. Artists can also have, you know, obviously unconscious intentions. You just figure out what it was about, you know, like later on. It's kind of all clicks, and you know the significance of it becomes clear later on. So intention can be it can be a much broader thing than people often think. I mean, one thing maybe it's worth saying. There's a view which I think sometimes has a presence in art schools, and it's something which art students often, you know, in crits they'll say if they're having difficulties, or maybe if not, you know, that they don't mind how people interpret the work. It can mean anything, and this is something which gains a kind of authority from one of the views that Elaine mentioned, which is associated especially with this essay by Roland Barthes, The Death of the Author. I think these certainly in recent philosophy, the tide has changed on that count, and there's a, roughly speaking, philosophers never agree, but there's much more of a sense that that intention plays an important role in the creation of artworks and in the fixing of artistic meaning. Maybe not always the necessary, the only one, because some of those artworks have a public artwork, its meaning changes, especially it develops in a way that the artist just can't have foreseen, and it gains a way through it's the way it's used by the community that owns it. But generally speaking, if you think back to this artist in the Crick, students usually really deep down they think they're not happy for their artwork to just mean anything, and I think those of you who are artists perhaps I should hesitate, but I'm inclined to think you'll deep down you'll feel this way too, that you'll have a sense that a general sense of what it means. But if someone comes along and says, "Oh, this means some crazy thing which you haven't even heard of," it's some strange political view you completely disagree with, you would say, "Yeah, it doesn't mean that. It certainly doesn't mean that." Sure, there's a spectrum of meaning, but there are also limits to interpretation.
Did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say yes, in terms of intention with respect to people I work with at Glasgow and Brighton when they're making paintings. Often intention will occur at different points. So they're also very precise when they make stretches. Say the stretch is 5 foot square, and then they prepare it by priming the ground 6 times, sanding it so it's perfectly smooth. And then the painting will just be an improvised painting, but they'd be based on a scale of the brush, the viscosity of the paint, a ratio of the binder, etc. And then they'll probably articulate that it's entirely it's about expression. But in fact, in a kind of pre-cognitive way, they've actually measured out a lot of the processes and a lot of the methods at that point. So, and often very effectively, and there obviously is intention relates to experimentation, etc. But the other thing I was going to say linked to that is this is an interesting book. The author is Dario Gambini, who's an art historian at the University of Amsterdam, called Potential Images. And it's about the fallout that Van Gogh had with Gauguin about painting a chair. When Van Gogh painted the chair, he liked the chair to be in front of him. Gauguin used to like to go in the other room and try to remember the chair. And if Gauguin thought he was getting something more authentic than having the chair in front. As a result, I see that's a key point for the development of abstraction. The idea of where the schism occurred between what an image represents, what an object can represent, and where representation occurs in painting moves towards abstraction. And then that might change how the artist, the painter or whoever, relates to intention, to do with the method of production.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a very complex idea. And every student I've worked with at Brighton has a different intention.
You mean
I've got
different model of intention?
In the third year at Brighton, there are 45 painters, and there's 45 different models of intention.
Wow, okay.
In my opinion.
Yeah.
There's nuances between. There's not one golden rule, if you know what I mean. It's about the nuance.
And what do you tend to talk about when people ask you about your work?
What, me? I don't know, you came to my studio. Lost for words. I suppose I tend to talk about the relationship to the ideas, where it originates. And in my particular case, it's to do with ideas of nature. So what nature can represent. A little bit of environmental aesthetics, which is a bit of that in there, in my opinion. Landscapes, because I'm from Northumberland, the borders near Scotland, so it's obviously in my psyche. Got another guy from the area there. So that's part of it, but then I talk about the relationship to painting.
Right.
So, for example, And again, I talk a lot when I talk within respect to intention, the word that crops up with art students a lot is context. So you often say the relationship to context, meaning how does it sit within tradition, genre, relationship to practitioners, whoever it is, and influence.
Yeah.
And what you're hoping to understand intention is that the student will say, I'm aware of the legacy of Hinterland and Peter Doyle, for example. If there's no answer or it's a bit vacuous, then you feel there's a disconnection.
Right.
So you have to try to evaluate the relationship to the words, to what's being acted out in the painting.
Okay.
Hope that makes some sense.
And it's interesting you talk about context. I mean, I was thinking about the Anna Fox works in the show, The Village. And I noticed after watching her interview that actually the way that they've been put into the exhibitions they've been exhibited differently elsewhere. So, you know, they've been exhibited with sound, they've been exhibited with other photographs. And Elena, what like in terms of kind of interpreting the work and thinking about it from a kind of curatorial perspective, I mean, having a work that is displayed, exhibited so differently, I mean, how does that kind of, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, and I think especially because we have access to a clear testimony of what, according to the artist, is how the work should be presented, which I think makes it interesting. But anyway, so from a philosophical point of view, at least from an analytical philosophical point of view, there hasn't been that much written on curating.
Right.
That's all right, but so there is one very interesting paper by Sherry Irvin, which is an American philosopher who writes a lot on contemporary art as well, and on museums and practices of display. And in this one paper, she talks about the appropriateness of displaying, of curating works of contemporary art. Because, I mean, if you think of a classical painting, your job as a curator when it comes to the appropriate way of displaying that works of art are fairly limited and constrained. If the painting is the right side up, if it is lit appropriately and the correct name is attached to it, that's pretty much how that work ought to be displayed. Whereas when you look at a lot of works of contemporary art, things become complex fairly quickly. If I remember correctly from the interview from Anna Fox, so those 3 photographs in the exhibition here, when they were displayed first in the 70s?
90s, 91,
yeah. Normally those photographs would be on the outside of a box, and there would be a soundtrack playing, and other photographs inside of the box where the audience could then look at the other works. So it seems that in order for us to appropriately appreciate not those individual photographs, but the work as a whole, as it was presented originally, we need to have access to that full installation. So from that point of view, you could argue potentially that the appropriate mode of display for that work of art in its ontological structure, so what that work really is, needs to have that box. We need to have that soundtrack. So I mean, what I work on a lot in my work is questions around ontology. So questions around what things are in essence.
Yeah.
So when you ask the question, what is Picasso painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon? Where is the art? Well, it's the physical object that you can hold. Whereas when you ask the same question about the work that Anna Fox is describing in that interview, where is the work? It seems to be in an appropriate display of a range of individually existing works of art, and I think that brings interesting problems that curators need to kind of negotiate when they're presenting or installing work.
I was just going to say, from my experience, and I work at a gallery called Cubic Gallery, and we have in-house curators 18 months on a cycle. They've got very good shows, and artists have had their first breaks there, like Christophini, etc. It's rare that artists and curators see eye to eye.
Mm-hmm.
There's a curious tension, do you know what I mean? Because obviously,
where do you think that comes from?
well, I think it's, in my opinion, apologies if I get this wrong, it's because an artist will have one idea. Like if I hang a painting, I'll use the example of the painting I had in the show here, the curator Tom Hammock.
Yeah.
painted the space dark blue. The background of my painting was the same blue, roughly, so that I couldn't see the painting. And I love Tom, he's a great guy, so I didn't say too much, but as the painter, inside I was hurting. But actually, I went for the curatorial voice, yes I did. But it's just that, but it's added another tier to dialogue. So when curation courses were founded, predominantly Goldsmiths and Royal College, I think early 90s, where it was, suddenly it added another tier of discourse. A good tier, but a critical tier. And often the negotiation with a curator and artist is very complex on lots of levels, especially when you put a few works together, because then you've got to set the dialogue up between the works. And that's often really difficult. So I think it's a real challenge. And the show that you put together with Tom was very challenging because you had works like Friedrich, Winter Landscape, and then you have contemporary. It was a very complex mix.
I mean,
but it was exciting, I think. You know, I mean, for all saying all this.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yes, I do. That is something that I'm writing on right now. Namely, how do we evaluate or appreciate curated exhibitions as the exhibition that they are? So not necessarily about the works that are on display and the exhibition, but how do we appreciate the work that the curator has done in putting together works of art? And then you can see when you read reviews that often art critics can be very scathing about the arguments that the curator has made. So an example that I discuss is an exhibition that took place in East Anglia. The title of the exhibition is Bacon and the Masters. So this was a show in which works of Francis Bacon were put next to artists that were influential for him. And one reviewer wrote, well, this completely destroyed my appreciation for Bacon, because now Bacon just comes off of this artist that just rips off all these old masters. So, I mean, what curators do in putting together works of art and the kind of effect that has on our appreciation of those individual arts is, immensely interesting, and that's
it's a very powerful role.
Yeah.
I noticed that in the exhibition, the work with the little rope in front of it is the painting.
Yeah.
Don't notice that. Claire Wood's work, which is enamel on aluminium, so it's not overly delicate. It looks more delicate when you really scrutinise it because it's poured enamel paint on a maroon surface. Sorry?
I worked on the exhibition, but I just want to clarify.
Okay.
There is a reason for that.
Yeah.
And it's because, well, the majority of works come from the Arts Council collection. And they do something, when a work comes into the collection, they take a description of the work from the artist.
Yeah.
And if you're going to show it, you get that information.
Yeah.
But you also get the conditions of how it's to be displayed.
Yeah, sure.
The Arts Council collection say that if it's an unglazed work, we have to put up some kind of barrier.
To be honest, I've only been playful. It's only because you know what I mean? I was just being a little bit mischievous, actually.
Yeah.
Because it is a particular surface, and actually, if you look at the paint, it's actually wrinkling in certain. It's like craquelure that the pre-Raphaelites used to add bitumen to paint to make that effect. This is just the fact that the way enamel dries is it'll be wet underneath the surface. It won't be fully dry. A bit like Ken Boucher is still wet 40 years later because the skin on the surface of the paper.
But I also kind of wanted to say that in response to your comments as well about, the responsibility of the curator and how an artist's work is presented. And with those, I think, was it the Faye Godwin pieces?
Yeah.
Again, when that goes into a collection, if it's not cared for in the same way, to a level that maybe the Arts Council collection will provide information on how it's to be displayed specifically, and with more complex contemporary art installations, you get that information.
Yeah.
Then, we may borrow it from a separate collection, a private collection, or, I don't know, it just doesn't come with the same amount of detail or the same prescription, which in one way is inhibiting, and in another it also kind of reaffirms your confidence in curating, that you're doing the very best for presenting works as they're intended to be.
Yeah, true.
Can I just say a little bit about curating? I mean, one of the things that I've found interesting in recent years about curating is the intention of the curator actually to tell their specific story by using other people's works, which I think is an interesting progression perhaps from traditional views.
Yeah, and I think for that, sorry. Yeah.
That's okay, I was just going to come in on that. I think there's a really interesting parallel there when they talk about journalism and how journalists should work. Because the reality it is, and when they're teaching journalists, they talk about the fact that what you're going to do is you're going to use other people's stories to tell the story that you want to tell, which is exactly what curators do. And one of the things to say, in order to be a good journalist, you don't distort the facts, the ideas, the truth behind the artist's work in order to tell your story, that you try and maintain the basic truth of that. And I think that's well worth considering within curation. You accept that you're going to take the work and you're going to tell a story that's essentially your story using their work, but that you want to do it in a manner that continues to support the truth of their work.
I think when you have really great historians or curators, they can reconfigure historical models. And the finest example of that, in my opinion, is that I grew up with the School of Paris being very dominant. The obvious people being Picasso, Matisse, etc., etc. And then an American historian, Robert Rosenblum, wrote a book in 1979 called Modern Painting in the Northern Romantic Tradition, and where he aligned painting with the Northern Romantic tradition, different kind of inflection, juxtaposition. And there's been many curated shows around that, but that was almost shifting, that was like a tanker turning from the School of Paris to a different reading, and bringing in Scandinavian painting from other countries that have been marginalised. So curators can do amazing things,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
obviously art historians, if they get the, readjust models and stuff.
Yeah. But I think crucial, sorry.
No, go on.
Yeah, I think what is crucial in order for us to be able to evaluate the work of the curator is that we attribute to them a kind of authorship, which I think wasn't present at all for exhibition makers before the 1960s. So up until that point, I mean, of course the term curator has a very long history, and you've got curators who are more involved in the restoration and the conservation of pieces of work, which is part of the etymological word of curator. But I think when we use the term curator as exhibition maker, we are talking about this author who is presenting an idea, who is telling us something through an exhibition. And that makes their work, the artifact that they're making, open for criticism. And I think if you read what curators see as the function of their work, or what they think makes for a good curated exhibition, in the edited collection by Bertel, which the book is called The Museum of the Future, which has lots of interviews with curators who address that very question, namely, what is for you a very good curated exhibition, and what makes for you a bad curated exhibition. I mean, answers are really diverse. I mean, for some curators, not being true to the artist is what makes a bad curated exhibition, whereas for other curators, it's exactly creating an exhibition that in some way creates a friction with what the artist has done in their work, or how a certain artist has already been perceived in the literature and other exhibitions. So it's exactly that kind of nagging friction, or that kind of the debatable aspect that some curators think, well, no, that is exactly what we as curators do. If you're not doing that, well, you're just making exhibitions, you're just making displays of works of art, but you're not really using the medium of curating. And I just want to say one more thing, which goes back to something what you said way back, but about the tension between artists and curators, but it just got back to me. So in Belgium, I'm from Belgium, there's an exhibition going on in Ostend, which is called The Raft. It's curated by Jan Hout, who is Jan Faber, who is a Belgian artist. And as the opening event of that show, there was a football match staged between curators and artists. So you had people dressed up as Harold Seeman or Peggy Guggenheim playing a team of artists. So to really play on that idea that there is this tension.
No draw, is it?
Sorry?
Is it no draw?
No, I think that
The critics were.
No.
The
The British one? Okay.
Yeah,
But what was nice is that Marcel Duchamp was actually playing for both.
It's like troublesome.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. Have we got any? I'm aware of the
5
time.
minutes.
5 minutes. 5 minutes for questions or
5 minutes to finish.
Great.
In whatever way you go.
Has anybody got anything that they're burning or otherwise to say?
Can I just come back to the point about intention?
Yeah,
Because,
absolutely.
if that's become so poignant for artists that are living, how do you then curate artists that no longer live?
Yeah.
And how do you mix those? Because that show you talked about is a mix show from Tom Hanley.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it had a mix of both. So how do you honour both? And were you asked about intention, the intention of the show, when you were asked or invited to be in it?
When I was invited to be in it was because it had the cast of David Friedrich, the only one in the UK. Spectacular painting. So the very fact it was in the same building was good enough. I mean, it was that simple. Also, he's a colleague of Brighton, so I couldn't say no. It was a very nice invitation, but that painting by Friedrich, it's stunning. It's unique. So that's, there's lots of other wonderful works in Turner and etc. etc. So I do like when historical history, modern contemporary history come together. I like it when things jump around a bit.
Yeah.
Break down time ideas and themes and various things. So it was exciting. I was just annoyed about the walk. We're still friends.
Anybody else?
I'd just like to bring us back to the photographic and the digital. When we think about digital creations and we talk about the Hulk, and you go, yeah, that's clearly a digital creation. But in actual fact, the glass that he picked up may equally be a mundane but totally digital creation. And so often we think that the digital creations are the weird things that can't happen. But so often in the things we see, the digital creations are actually mundane things. And that, in terms of, where does that term, in terms of considering, where's the truth, if we're going to go down that route?
Yeah, I think that's a complex issue. So if I understand you right, you're saying that we often don't know when we're looking at a digital rendering or not. And yeah, I think it's pretty clear that's increasingly true. Probably more so than probably more so than we think. And I mean, one thing that means is that we're often mistaken about what we're looking at. Human beings, we are subject to illusion, and we always have been. And I think, just as in the past, we're all subject to illusion rather more than we think. So I think, in a sense, nothing's changed.
I think actually one of the real frustrations for an artist can be that they produce something that isn't digitally created and people think it is. And that's really
I mean,
in that case, they, a viewer will not have understood the artwork, or what's salient, the significance of the artwork.
There's kind of a challenge there, though, as an artist, to produce something that you can show to be authentic rather than manipulated.
One thing that David Josselett has mentioned, and James Elkins and Paul Crowther, and one or two others have mentioned that the digital has highlighted temporality in painting. That it's actually, to make a painting, it's quite a slow process. And so in a way, by challenging it, it's invigorated it. So although the digital is doubting, it's set parameters, reshifted parameters. For a lot of painters, it's reinvigorated painting. And that's what photography did, in what advertising and cinema did for people like Richard Hamilton. So it's kind of, that's why painting is called by Josselett success medium, because it has a capacity to morph and remorph, and it's malleable because it responds to these other forms of visual engagement. That's my speech for painting.
I think just to link the personal bit to that, I recently created a set of purely digital pieces, and when I've shown them to people, the number of people in the audience who've gone again, so that was never a real object. No, that was never a real object. So and they ask exactly the same question again in a different way. And that questioning of the nature of reality and the nature of the reality that we find ourselves living in when we walk around the street with a mobile phone and we're taking more notice of the Google map that's helping us get where we are than the physical reality around us.
But I've just moved house.
He's doing it all the time.
Can I just ask, did photography actually free painting? Did it?
I think it did,
Because,
yeah.
because the paintings didn't
Well,
have to be representation.
Well, it did that, but it also, if you look at someone like Degas, who I think is a truly great painter, it freed it on a very simple formal level, on form. It gave them clues to how to create compositions, cropping, just very simple. And it's, you know, if you look at things like off-centre or whatever, there's something, so it expanded the aesthetic pictorial range that a lot of the Impressionists used, and even the Barbizon school, people like Corot, etc., Theodore Rousseau. So I think my understanding of other media is that it invariably invigorates painters. I wasn't around when the Barbizon school around, but I get that sense.
Great. Any last thoughts from anybody?
Quick ones.
So back to the idea of gesture in the photograph. Can that not be shown by intention and the process that you were highlighting about, you know, the photographer deciding to go somewhere to do, you know, take this particular photograph? Does that not show the
Yeah, I think it
artist
probably
at some
does.
point?
But I suppose when gesture historically within painting has been the tactile, haptic, the touch thing, whereas that's probably psychological. But that's fine, so gesture's fluid. It's a fluid terminology that maybe, did I say the wrong thing? Yeah. Because I was speaking, it's coming in my head. So I think it's just different. And of course, it's when I teach photographers, I'm really mucking around.
Yeah, I think the idea of painting being more real because you can see the brushstrokes kind of made me think, oh, you know, I want people to know that I've taken a photograph or I've done this and I've done that. And it's, yeah, that shows up in another way, and that's fun.
To me, they're equally valid. From me on that.
Great. Well, yeah. Thanks very much, everybody. It's great to have you here, and round of applause for our panel.